Hello, everybody. Welcome to a joint virtual event with Books and Company in Oconomowoc, Boswell Book Company in Milwaukee, and Alliance Francaise in, I would say it's of Milwaukee, I would say officially, though they have a larger base than that. I'm Daniel from Boswell. With that said, I'd like to introduce Anne LaPlay from Alliance Francaise de Milwaukee, and thank you for forgiving my bad pronunciation.
Bonsoir. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. So we're so excited to chat with Edward today. So on February 28th, we're showing our own film. It is part of a nationwide effort called The Night of Ideas. And this year, the theme is bigger, stronger, better. And we're actually doing a film on what is happening to the environment with sort of our growth. And it's called Once You Know. It will be Tuesday, February 28th at the Audubon Nature Preserve. So visit the Alliance's website, www.afmilwaukee.org for more information. Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to introduce Lisa Badoin from Books and Company.
Hi, welcome everybody, and welcome Edward. Edward Chisholm moved to Paris after graduating from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. He lived in the City of Lights for 7 years, the first 4 working all manner of low-paying restaurant jobs from waiting and bartending. While trying to figure out what he wanted to do next, building a career as a writer, just kind of figuring life out. And it is in those years that A Waiter in Paris is born. So that's what we'll be talking about today. Edward Chisholm now makes a living as a freelance writer. His work appears in the New York Times, the Guardian, the Financial Times, and the Financial Times. He currently lives in Switzerland and is joining us from Switzerland. So we've got the snow, Edward, and maybe you do.
Fortunately not. We've got almost spring weather, so we need to do a swap.
Yeah, we do.
But thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And we sometimes start by having our authors read a little bit from the book to kind of give us a flavor of the story. Do you want to do that?
Flavor's quite an apt descriptor, I guess, for a book about a restaurant. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the very beginning, which is the amuse-bouche, which kind of sort of sets the scene of everything. So it's lunchtime and the tables in the dining room are filling up. The waiters in their smart black suits and bow ties are looking professional, busy, and distinctly French as they scurry about handing out menus, taking orders, fielding questions, and finally disappearing like assassins or monks through the small swinging door at the back of the dining room. I stand there watching it all, trying to hide my mounting panic, wondering if I should come clean with one of them, take them aside and tell them the truth. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. But I can't even do that. It would alert them to another fact I'm keen to hide, that I don't actually speak French. I'm in the middle of a smart restaurant in the capital of France, dressed to all intents and purposes as a Parisian waiter, and I can't even speak the language. And this isn't some small cafe or local bistro. This is a genuine, full-blown Parisian restaurant, replete with a terrifying woman at the lectern by the door, an army of surly waiters, a director who looks like Napoleon Bonaparte's much taller cousin, and a spiteful manager who wants to be gone because he knows the truth. I don't belong here. I've managed to swing the job, if it can be called that, through a series of well-timed shoulder shrugs and a pre-learned monologue. If you find out now I can't speak French, that will be it. I must fit in at all costs. If I don't, whatever this is, a job or a trial shift, I'm still unsure, will be over. And I'll be back to padding the frozen streets of Paris from dawn until dusk with a folder of CVs. Present facts are these. I arrived sometime after dawn in a cheap, baggy suit and have until recently been kept away from the other waiters, like the Minotaur, in an underground cellar as I polished glasses until my fingers blistered. From the brief moments I have been around the other waiters, I hear the same word, runner, which I assume is me. Of course, I have no idea what a runner is, and even less idea what he's actually meant to do. So, as the restaurant continues to fill up with elegantly dressed Parisians, I remain as still as possible to avoid being noticed. Watching the other waiters for clues, anything that allows me to decipher how it all works, how the machine runs. They move like clockwork, locked in some strange choreography, moving without thought, one step ahead of their diners, adding and removing silver cutlery, slight bows, chairs pulled out, white serviettes laid across laps, wine uncorked and served with Gallic ceremony, discreet smiles, nods of the head. Needless to say, I have neither pen nor notepad. I've no idea what's in the menu, nor how to take orders, nor indeed if I should. I have no idea where the food comes from, nor how it's made, nor who makes it. Quite naturally, diners attempt to attract my attention, but after a couple of unsuccessful attempts at trying to understand them, I stick to ignoring them, which is surprisingly easy and gives me an air of professionalism. Just when I think I've finally succeeded in blending into the heavy red curtain behind me, I notice the thin-faced manager in his grey suit prowling on the other side of the dining room. The restaurant, which is decorated in a classic French style with high ceilings and low lighting, flaking gold-rimmed Louis XVI mirrors, wallpaper with fleur-de-lis motif, and large single-glazed windows that let the flat light of Parisian winter illuminate the whole scene, is now almost full. From the tables, light chatter, the delicate clinking of cutlery on ceramic, and expensive perfumes waft up towards the world of the waiters, who soar above with giant silver trays, the white tea cloths draped across their forearms, trailing behind them like an aeroplane's vapor trail. I'll probably stop there, otherwise I could go on for a long time.
But that just really sets the scene, and it's a bit terrifying. And from your shoes, I was like, oh man. Does that still stick so clearly with you?
I still remember. It's very like a very potent memory actually of arriving there and being completely out of my depth and finding myself in one of these sort of emblematic institutions, something which is so distinctly Parisian. And yeah, it was nerve-wracking. I really wanted to stay, so I needed to for finances as well. So it was a moment of great stress for many weeks actually.
I do, there's so many things I really like about this book, but one of them is you really do put us in that place. And so much of the book reminded me of going to college or university where you sort of, and that intimidating, like the first time you step into the, except for those people who like go to their neighborhood school, but when you go away and the whole, everything seems so alien. And on top of this, you're not speaking French, and there's so many different people, there's so many different jobs, and you slowly bring us all into it. And by the end of the story, you feel like you've had, I don't know how long you were there, but it feels for me like, the 4-year education of a server. I just thought that was glorious. And I love the way you make things that seem so alien be very familiar by the end of the story.
That's very kind. Yeah, I mean, I think when you're an outsider looking in as well, you're very attuned to everything. As everything is so vivid because everything's so new and so novel, and you are completely lost and you're trying to navigate it. But because I was an outsider, I was also an observer, a kind of spy, if you will. And I think it was just all being downloaded into my mind the whole time.
Okay, one more thing.
And learned from these people.
Before I pass to Lisa, I do have to ask you about the language, because one thing people, when I'm recommending the book to people and they start the book and they're like, I don't understand how he couldn't speak French and got through it. And so you have to tell us, you talk a little about it, but I think there's like, at what point did you feel like you could communicate well enough to people? Obviously, you didn't think you were going to ever be a waiter or server itself and still not speaking French. So where was that story going? Yeah,
so it was a baptism of fire. Obviously, because I wanted the book to be a kind of a documentary piece about contemporary Paris and the society of Paris, I couldn't dwell too much on the language barrier. So at the beginning, I played with time a little bit and contracted the amount of time it took me to learn. So if anyone's reading it thinking I learned French fluently in a couple of weeks, don't worry, that's not the case. But when I arrived, honestly, in England where I went to school, you're meant to learn French. It's obligatory. But I was so terrible when I got to Paris, I couldn't even count to 20. I used to get confused between like 14, 15, 16. I don't know why. I just couldn't get through. So, ended up in Paris, which we'll probably talk about because of a French girl. There's lots of stories start like that, I guess. And the funny thing is you're very, very quickly, your brain becomes accustomed to picking out the words in a sentence that somebody's saying at you and kind of constructing your version of what they're saying. It's possibly slightly erroneous, but you'll get the main gist. So if you hear, someone's pointing at a table and saying a word you don't know, I think I said in the book, débarrasser. I learned that quite quickly. It means sort of to clear something away, clear the table. So like a child learning, you quickly. The problem is the words you're hearing and understanding in your mind, and probably many of the people who are listening have this if they're learning French or speaking French. Unless you're practicing them, when you then go to say what you think the word is, it just comes out as a sort of weird, mispronounced noise. And I used to get to this point where I knew when people had stopped understanding me because their head would turn on its side slightly as they tried to follow what I was saying. So I genuinely really had to avoid speaking for quite a long time, very basic things in the present tense. And then I worked out the future tense. Things in the past tense kind of got there. Anything with a reflexive verb was a nightmare. And I used to go and work out phrases I needed to say in the evening or in the morning. And then I'd memorize them, and I'd only have like a few stock phrases. But luckily in French, you can get by with quite a small toolbox of words. Unlike in English, I think you'd need more. So it is feasible.
Well, and I think too, just everyone's so stunned by the language barrier, but I think of all the workers that have come there under more strenuous conditions and had to quickly learn the language. And not only that, they're in the back of the house, and there's a lot more cultural barriers to overcome as far as the language barriers. And you really brought that to life, how the struggle of coming from a completely different space with a completely different experience, and then being looked down upon so much, along with the language barrier.
Yeah, and this was something that was very humbling in a sense, and I think kind of what I needed. We in the Western world, in Europe and in North America, we finish our studies at university, at college, and then we go into the world, and we kind of prepared for a conceptual version of the world, right? It's the version we learn in the classrooms. We've read Sartre, we've read the history of France, so we think we know things, but actually, no, that's not the real world. And so, inside my head, I had all my years of education, I had all the things I knew, but in this environment, I was useless. To these people, I was an idiot. I couldn't communicate. They thought I had a problem, like literally a problem. They didn't have any respect for me. And I'm very aware that, and I say this in the book, and this was when it's happened to me, it was about 10 years ago, but the reason I got this job is because I was a white guy. That's why I was able to be front of house. But had I been like a Sri Lankan refugee or somebody else, I would have been, as you say, down in the kitchens or a plongeur or something. And there, again, you're learning French quickly, and it's a kind of a bastardized French. It's a mix. There's a different French you learn. And I remember I'd go home in the evening and try and work out words I'd written down on pieces of paper phonetically, and some of them I just couldn't find. And it turned out they were Tamil swear words or Portuguese words, because they were used in sentences in French, and I was like, "What is punde?" Like I can't. And I'd ask French people, like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then it would turn out it was a very, very rude Tamil swear word. So it was confusing for me as well to learn French that way. But yeah, and it does. It puts you in other people's shoes, really, and you realize how hard it is. To go to a different society where you don't know the rules and the regulations, and you can be used and abused because you really need the job. And some people may be coming from a war-torn country or from abject poverty, so the conditions they're falling into, and this isn't specific to Paris either, it's any modern city, but they're ripe for being used, unfortunately, because they're probably accepted. It's probably better than where they're from, and that it's hard to organize yourself and join unions and things because you don't speak the language.
I don't know, Lisa, there's so many ways to go from this, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, you just
we can take it up a little. Like,
oh, you want me to go from it? You can go from it.
Okay. I mean, the kitchen. Yes, what you said about they didn't call. They said they were Tamils. They weren't Sri Lankans. I just read for our book club. We just read The 7 Moons of Mali Almeida, which is set in Sri Lanka and is about the war, and it's just a great. And the restaurant reminded me a lot. I don't know if any of you have ever read it, but if you liked the cacophony of the restaurant, you would like the purgatory waiting room, which this sort of reminded me of. He's been murdered and he doesn't know why, and it's like some DMV office with him trying to go. But it really did explain sort of the situation of the Tamils, and
Hmm.
the way the restaurant was divided with, there were certain kinds of people in the upper kitchen and certain kinds of people in the lower kitchen, and then like you said, the French people and the white people and North Africans too, right? They
Yeah,
would also
yes, very
be
much so.
servers. Also sort of got duplicated in like the way the neighborhoods were sort of sometimes set. Like some neighborhoods
Mhm.
seem to have lots of different kinds of people together, but then you mentioned, well, this is where the sub-Saharan African folks live, and this is where the Maghrabi live, and
Yeah. Well, so one of the reasons I kind of wanted to write the book as well is because later on, once I was no longer working in restaurants and bars and doing these kind of jobs, I'd often come back to the restaurant as a metaphor for explaining to people who were visiting perhaps Paris or France or just arrived, for explaining kind of French society, because it became a kind of microcosm of Paris, and Paris sort of by extension France, with the hierarchy, the way people are organized and divided, and the city as well. It's a reflection of the city. So, you have what's fantastic about Paris is it's quite small in terms of the actual geographical size of it within the périphérique, the ring road that encircles Paris. And there you can cross a street and go from one culture to a different one. You can go from a sub-Saharan African area, so everyone's pretty much like French African, and then you can go to the other side of the road and it would be maybe North African, so Maghrebian, and everyone's speaking Arabic, and you can go to the Chinese area, and so it's incredible how separate it is, but how actually it's a rich tapestry which is all overlapping. All these people it's not segregated per se, but they all are together but apart. And the restaurant was also a way of sort of visualizing that. So up top, out the front, in the dining room, there's you and I, the tourists, the Parisians, the people who eat in restaurants. And then I describe the waiters, and it's nice in English because we call it waiting, as I describe their worlds like purgatory. They're kind of in between the two worlds, not quite in paradise, not quite in hell. It's sort of flip between these two worlds. And then as you go, and it's a descent down into the kitchen. So you are going deeper underground. And you pass by the pass, which is a kind of nexus of the restaurant where the plates arrive and are organized by these three Tamil gentlemen who, previously had been guerrillas fighting for the Tamil Tiger army, and now they're plating up things. And as you go deeper down, you start to have the cooks, and then you have the plongeur, and again the demographic changes. But all these people have these incredible backstories and incredible histories of working together in this incredibly stressful environment to make meals for people who are pretty much oblivious what's going on behind the swinging door, just a few meters away. And I always found that tension quite interesting, the sort of manic chaos behind the wall and the sort of artificial luxury of the dining room, which I think also reflects Paris, because if we look at Parisian and Paris, it's a image, and how you present yourself is very important, etiquette and things. And it's same with us in a dining room, in a restaurant, sorry. But often a lot of these very beautiful buildings, you'll go in through the ground floor and it'll be quite glamorous. But if you keep pushing further and further behind the facade, you quickly get into very small, forgotten rooms, these little warrens, people living in 6 meter squared studios, all sorts of things. So essentially the restaurant is a metaphor for Paris or any modern city.
And I think the book really does that so beautifully, because you can really, it's a good entry into talking about all of the different classes, the different ethnicities, and even within a society, but just how the power is handed off and structured, even on the even in front of room, the situation with the power, like when you do the ring and how everything is set out in the dining room, and that shift of power. Do you want to talk about that? Because both Daniel and I know I just took yours.
Oh my gosh.
It just seemed like a natural segue to talk about power.
So much power struggles on every level.
Here we go.
And that's
it's quite funny, isn't it? Yeah, and it's something we see. And again, the restaurant becomes a microcosm for a family or a business. There's these, because you're kind of thrown together, and then you have to work for a shared objective, which isn't really your own. It's just because most of the time you just want to get paid. But no one's freed from this judgment. You as a diner are also part of it. So when you arrive at the restaurant, you're already being looked up and down and judged in a matter of a second by the lady at the hostess at the door, and mentally they're going to seat you appropriately, if you will. And in this particular restaurant, which this experiences are based on, they had a sort of unspoken rule amongst the hostesses on where to seat people, and so they had a place in the middle of the restaurant, so the geographic center where everyone could see you. And in summer, when the terrace was open, it was obviously the front and middle of the terrace where people would walk past. And so to be sat here, you had to have one of three qualities. You had to be either beautiful, rich, or famous. And if you had all three, you were like a unicorn, and so you were treated exceptionally well. But if you had one of the other qualities, it was fine. And these tables, they would have menus placed upon them to suggest they had been reserved, so that when you or I come in as a casual visitor, dressed, I don't know, normal clothes, but not necessarily haute couture or something, they could just casually say, and you say, well, what about these tables if you're full? They'll say, no, those are reserved. You can see the menus are on the tables already. So that already begins sort of the process of what's going on, if you will.
And then there's the same sort of power struggle with the waiters being assigned the tables.
Yes. So this leads into another thing. So the waiters had a sort of, again, unofficial way of rating diners, if you will, predominantly based on how well they would tip, but also how grumpy they might be or prone to complaining. So at the bottom of their list, the people they wanted least were French people, of course, because they tended not to give particularly good tips. And we'd be more than happy to complain about the food. Towards the top end, the people who are most generous when it came to tips would be Brazilians and Japanese people. They were considered the sort of holy grail. And then you get to sort of German businessmen were pretty happy to dish the cash around. And then Americans were quite well viewed, but there'd been a tendency that American tourists, I think the waiters felt of assuming that tipping wasn't really part of the French culture. And so much to their chagrin, they'd hear them say, oh no, you don't do this. It's a socialist country, you don't need to tip them here or whatever. And the poor waiter with his tail between his legs would go back to the kitchen and probably go out back for a cigarette, I guess.
Oh, I just want to say that the way, they're like, how dare you think this is a socialist country, we shouldn't tip. And yet at night when they try to take the metro, one of the guys says to him, well, we're a socialist country, so you don't have to pay the fare in the train. You could fare.
Yeah. They're very good at following the rules that they want to follow. French people in general, and I think that's quite a charming sort of quality. There are the rules that apply to them, and then the rules that apply to other people. So the metro was fantastic. I remember the first time that happened. The guy in front of me just jumped over the barriers, and there's somebody in a kiosk, the ticket person, right next to it. And in London, if you did that, I'd probably be pinned against the floor by the police and escorted out quite quickly. And as he explained to me, he said, "Oh no, that's not his job. His job is to sell the tickets, not to enforce them." And then that's kind of explains a little bit, and that's very much happened in the restaurant as well. Like you wouldn't start doing somebody else's job because, firstly, you weren't paid enough to bother doing extra work, I think is the sort of fundamental part of it. But secondly, if you did it wrong and made a mistake, you could get in trouble, you could get fired. So it just wasn't worth it. So, the Tamils, for example, who were manning the pass, when I returned as a runner with all the dirty plates and all this kind of stuff, I had to do specific things. I had to put the cutlery into a certain bucket. I had to put the plate somewhere else. They wouldn't do that. They would just scream Tamil obscenities at me if I didn't do that, and I'd be berated by waiters. So it was something that was reflected in all aspects of sort of the society I was living in.
Yeah, because you brought that in with even the schooling. Like if you went to school here, then that's where you were going to be, and you couldn't transfer your skills over, which is why you were kind of stuck because you didn't go to school in certain spots.
Yeah. So that's something that's quite interesting compared to sort of the sort of English-speaking world, where we had this notion of transferable skills. For example, you could have studied history, but you could go and work in I don't know, an IT company, because your education is seen as a level of education as opposed to a specific thing. In France, I think it's changing a little bit now, but in France, very early on, you specify kind of what your education will look like. So maybe it'd be a more of a maths like focused one, or maybe it'd be a more literary focused one. And so you'll do the studies which follow that, which means later on, if you want to change jobs, they don't understand. So I'd studied history, and I couldn't find a job in a museum. I didn't want a job in a museum. But when I applied for jobs, they said, well, as a journalist or whatever, they'd say, well, you haven't studied journalism, or you haven't studied, advertising, whatever job I'd apply for. So the second question was, oh, so you must be here studying for that. And I was like, no, I left university 2 years ago. I've been working in London. I'm here to carry on working. And it was a real problem for the sort of French mentality. They like to encadrer people, which means put them in a frame, essentially. And that's something hard to get out of. And therefore, the purgatory of working in the restaurant, the longer you're working there, the harder it is maybe to get out. But also, it was an incredibly joyous and fun experience to be there. It was hard at times, but to be in Paris was magical, regardless of some of the experiences.
I
hope that comes across in the book.
It does.
It does, yes.
And the humor and yes.
Talking about very serious things at the moment, but yeah.
You were, we were lucky to come up. We're thrilled. We've so enjoyed this book, and books about restaurants and books about France are very popular. So, this is the intersection of two beloved subjects. I actually heard about the book originally on Milk Street, where Chris Kimball said it was I believe he said it was his favorite book of last year. So congratulations on that. And I just happened to be talking to my friend John, who Lisa knows as well. And I said, I really want to read this book. And he said, oh, I read it. I bought it in France. So I was lucky enough to, so apparently it was in a French bookstore somewhere, and that was great. And
so I haven't been blacklisted in France yet.
You have not been. I was one of
I always open my front door worried that there might be some angry French chefs with carving knives there or something.
Well, that's actually my question, because I want, we are all, and some one of our people in the chat has talked about this as well. We want to know, I know you weren't in 10 restaurants, and you weren't doing a sociological study, but how indicative is this book of your particular restaurant that you worked in, as opposed to restaurants in general in France? Like, obviously some of the things are very specific to yours and some are not. So I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, and so this is important, so this is a specific restaurant at a specific time with a specific group of people. And I hadn't gone to the restaurant as a kind of anthropological study to watch these people. I was just lost in life, really. I didn't know what to do, but I just knew I wanted to be in Paris and loved being in Paris, and loved French cinema and literature, and I knew this was where I needed to be. But though there are things that are specific to this restaurant, such as the people who I worked with, I think it's safe to say that some of the things, such as, maybe I'll change how I'm saying it slightly, but it's not unique to Paris. Firstly, I think it's something we find in any large cities, and it's found in a certain type of restaurant. It's not found at the very highest end, where you can see into the kitchen, and you've got highly trained professionals. Even the waiting staff are trained in like hotel schools in Switzerland and things. It's a very, sort of the elite, if you will. And it's not in those small places with handwritten menus where, again, you can probably see into the kitchen and there's something honest about it. It's that murky place in the middle where you have these very big restaurants which are kind of pretending to possibly be something they're not. There's a bit of artifice about the whole thing. It's not very clear where the food's from. Are they making it all? Are they ordering it in? It's ready-made and just using microwaves to do it. And I think this is something we as diners, as consumers, need to be aware of, because in the book there's an absence of law, if you will, in the kitchens, in the world behind that swinging door. The politicians, the lawmakers, they're sitting in the dining room. There's no law out back. And the only way we can change this, because these people don't have a voice, is by our own behaviors. So I think we just need to be a bit more discerning about where we eat, the kind of places we frequent and what our expectations are. And I say this in the book, often we go to places like France and Italy and Spain, and we love how cheap the food is. Like, oh, it's so good. I ate, 4 roast chickens for $5 or whatever. That's not a good thing, because that means somebody or lots of people along that food chain are sort of paying the price. So I think it's a wider conversation. It's not all restaurants. There are many fantastic restaurants in Paris. Obviously, in these tourist areas, no, stay away. These are the typical places that you want to avoid. But your small places in local neighborhoods, family run by young people, etc., are good. But often you can see it. You're going to these restaurants in Paris, and you go down to the toilets. I mean, a lot of kitchens now in Paris are staffed by Tamils and Sri Lankans and things. So it's not a bad sign, and these people are very good at what they do. But you just want to make sure that they're not being used and abused, really, and that you're eating something which is being cooked. Unless you don't really care, and in which case, if you don't know, do you mind? It's kind of the question as well.
There was even an article I think it was in the top New York Times about, I think it was like 5 or 6 years ago, about the slow incursion of frozen entrees even into smaller restaurants.
Yeah. I think it's something like 8 out of 10 croissants in France are now from frozen.
Wow.
Huge. Yeah. But then you speak to the boulanger, the bakers, and they tell you, the amount of time it takes them to make croissants and how much they sell them. It's easier just to buy frozen and then make the actual bread themselves. So again, it's really complicated. But just ask. Did you make these? It's a valid question. I think we should know as consumers. When we go to the supermarket, we're looking at where food comes from, if it's organic, if it's free range or whatever. Whereas in a restaurant, weirdly, we don't ask these questions, do we? Which is quite strange because of that notion of the performance. Because, and I say again in the book, it's sufficient as a way to allude to the chef. I spoke to the chef, he did it especially for you, madame. And your image you'll be like, oh, of course, some wonderful French chef, probably quite grumpy with a big knife, but he prepared this. What you're not imagining is a guy from Angola with broken French and broken English being screamed at by a Tamil guy because he hasn't done it correctly.
Right, and that person might not even be able to talk to the chef. They're so far, so many
exactly.
barriers. Yeah.
No, completely.
I just can't imagine those back rooms too, with all of, like you described, the kitchen upstairs. Is that the main kitchen? That was a fiery hell with just the sweat coming down, and they're standing in water.
Yeah.
Now then down below, they're standing in water and cooking because it leaks. Like this, are crazy to think about your food coming out from something like that.
Yeah, even so George Orwell was a big influence of mine, or a big literary hero, and still is. And one of the books I had when I was in Paris was his essays. But one of the first books I really connected to as a reader when I was a teenager was Down Out in Paris and London. And in that, he says something along the lines of, the more you pay for your food, the more people have touched it. And it's a little bit similar now, in the sense it's kind of better not to know where your food comes from. I mean, most time it doesn't matter. We're quite hardy. We're quite good at dealing with germs, and it's probably quite good for us occasionally. There are limits, of course, but a working kitchen is one of these big ones is pretty interesting to see, maybe after you've eaten as opposed to before.
One of the things Lisa and I have been talking about is how wonderful you are with, you're a great storyteller, of course, but you're also the folks in the story, the people that you profile are just so much larger than life, and mostly done with great love and sometimes great hate. But I wanted to ask you about some of your favorites and some of our, and Lisa and I wanted to ask about some of our favorites. Could you talk a little, and I don't know how he pronounces his name, but I think Franjo, the sommelier.
Franjo, yeah.
Franjo.
Yes.
Wonderful. What a wonderful.
Yeah, he was incredibly, and again, this is an interesting thing as well. I think we talk about the job of waiting. For us, our conception of a waiting job is often a sort of temporary thing that you do whilst you're studying or whilst you're waiting for something else. But in France, there still exists this notion of waiting, the service industry as a profession, as a métier. So it's something kind of noble to do. And although a lot of the people I was working with in this particular restaurant, because it wasn't a hugely respected institution where you'd want to end up as a waiter, they were younger. I mean, I was in my early 20s, and now it's funny because I'm in my mid 30s, and I'm wondering how old some of these people must have been about my age and younger, but they seemed a lot older. But Franjo, who was the sommelier, he was of retirement age. I think he was past retirement age, but he still had to work. And he was quite interesting because he told a story of the sort of longevity of the waiting profession, and also the, referencing Orwell again. At that time there were lots of White Russians in Paris, or descendants of White Russians. Franjo, he was he'd fled Yugoslavia because he got involved in quite radical student politics. He didn't really speak about it, but he had to. The secret police were after him. He sort of alluded to it, and he would have probably ended up in prison. So he left, and he was meant to get a train to Germany because he spoke a little bit of German because it used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the train was cancelled when he got there in the morning, and they had no choice but to get a night train to Paris. It was the next thing leaving. So he found himself in Paris, and the only thing he could say, which he learned on the train, was "Voulez-vous coucher avec moi?" And no one told him what it meant. And that was it. And then he's in Paris. And he was quite a gruff and cold person, but as I started speaking to him, and when I wanted to get advanced at becoming a waiter, I realized I needed to learn more about wine. I used to basically, in my breaks, when I did eventually start getting them, spend time with him and just chat about his life and also learn about wines. And yeah, these are moments that always stay with me, and every time I see certain wines and bottles and things, I do think back to those moments I shared with him. And it's a funny, even now I think that I was 22 and he's probably 62, and we'd sit in this cafe exhausted, drinking cheap versions of wines for him to explain to me what they were.
I was gonna say, it is those moments that even though it was hard and you didn't get time off, it's those characters, the connections you made, and the shared space that is the joys in life. I mean, it just became so apparent, those stories.
Yeah, and the camaraderie, I think I wasn't expecting, what I was looking for. We always kind of want to be accepted as an outsider, and to eventually slowly break through, the different barriers and become one with these people was incredibly rewarding.
I think one of my favorites was when you guys broke into Lucien's family's restaurant, right? Did I get that right? And
yes.
That time in the middle of the night, being in there, and his freedom to go in and just eat things, and the way that food was shared in that space, and drink was shared in stories, versus like being in a bigger restaurant or being at the pub. That was such an intimate, magical moment.
Yeah, and that's one of the beauties of France, is that regional food and dishes tell a story, don't they? So his mother was from the Auvergne, so you'd have lots of Auvergnan dishes, or sometimes you'd be with other people from different parts of France, and you discover all these dishes they'd cook using family recipes often. And that was nice. That's what food really is about. It's those ephemeral shared moments which you'll never get back, like that dish on your plate. It'll never happen again in that specific circumstances. So yeah, these are the moments just to live for, the joyful, ephemeral ones, the meals.
No, go on. I was gonna say, I'm just sure we all have those moments that we can think back, or I hope we do, where there was that meal, that one dish, and you can't replicate it because it's the food and the company and the light and everything. So Daniel, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, in terms of the beautiful moments, is also you were sort of during your stay in the restaurant, sort of in the midst of a coup of sorts. I don't know. I mean, I feel like, you couldn't have really had a more thriller-like experience in this, once again, another struggle for power. Do you feel like, what was that experience like, realizing that people were gunning for people's jobs and people are trying to get people fired, and you have other experiences where you're you have, we were talking about the story about Valentine, where everybody comes together and supports each other. So it was, on one hand, you have everybody kind of working together, and other times you have like people, like factions and fighting and things
Yes.
like that.
Yeah, there was a ruthlessness to it, certainly. And so what you're talking about is the kind of change of ownership, essentially, and the manager, one of the sort of managers looking to become the director. And I guess it's kind of a little bit like life, in the sense you can either just keep your horizon close to you and look at your immediate surroundings and everything's fine, but there are always sort of greater tectonic shifts going on which are going to have an effect on you. And in the restaurant, a change of ownership, for example, or a change of management could herald good or bad changes. In this case, worse, because it was about driving down costs, and it meant people were losing their jobs. And because of the precarious nature of these jobs, people don't have contracts per se, or if they do, they can just cut down your hours until it's just not feasible to carry on. That camaraderie, that sense of oneness, can quickly be destroyed by the pressures from above. People just thinking about their jobs, people just thinking that they need to keep paying their rent, they put money aside for their child's education, etc. So it was a wake-up call, really, that it wasn't just a jolly, as the English might say. This is serious. This was life, and people's livelihoods were at stake with some of these decisions.
And that scene with Valentine was so just stressful, and you were sent out, that whole moment, and it was so subtle and
yeah.
It was subtle and yet not, like you didn't expect everyone to just draw that line. No.
Yeah, this was something, and again, this was to do with some racist diners, an elderly couple who didn't want to be served by one of the members of staff, which I just assumed this is not something you'd ever experience, and nor did the staff. So the staff were like, okay, well, if they don't refuse to be served by Valentina, we're not going to serve her. The manager had a different view on this. His view was, no, they're customers, we'll serve them. That's our job. We're here to serve food. And again, it raises questions, sort of where do you draw the line? And the irony is, sure, I mean, the joke's on them, because they don't want to be served by somebody with a certain color skin, but they didn't realize that all their food's been made by some people with the same colored skin. So, again, it's this is an exception. And please, the Daily Mail said I suggested all French people were racist, which isn't at all the case. This is a specific incident, but and that leads me on to something else. Because I really wanted to give an incredibly accurate portrait of contemporary Paris, something which I find in my reading that it's hard to come across, and from my experience in living there, I had to be very judicious in my choices when it came to which incidents and vignettes and scenes I wanted to include in this story. I wanted to give a balanced, appropriate view of Paris. So, it felt important to talk about this because it spoke to some of the dynamics, the politics in France, but also obviously to include the moments of levity and the moments of camaraderie, and the moments of living in terrible, flea-ridden apartments and having bed bugs and, this kind of stuff. It's all part of the deal. And so hopefully it gives a complete picture of Paris, at least of the Paris 10 years ago, but it hasn't changed too much.
We have a question that sort of plays on this from Rob that asked you about other things in Paris would you like to do? And I was curious, what was something on that note, something about Paris that just didn't fit in the book that you really would have wanted to write about otherwise?
There were so many things to write about, and now it's been a few years, so I can't completely remember. But the book has an absence of social life, what it was like to in that first year, which this book's set around, there wasn't much of a social life. But afterwards, obviously, I lived in Paris for 7 years. So, strolls along the Seine in the evening, or drinking on the Seine, or, the old cinemas, or this kind of strange thing that happens in this village-like city. I would have loved to have included. Music is quite absent, I realize, from my book. But I needed to keep the focus on the waiters, in the same way that I didn't speak too much about the chefs or the plongeurs, because that's another book. That's Anthony Bourdain's book or somebody else's. It's not. This had to be about waiters. It had to be a different thing. So yeah, many things I can unfortunately write about.
Somebody asked whether your poor living conditions that you describe in the book affected your health. Like
no, I mean the worst thing that happened were the bed bugs, I guess. Without no spoiler. But yeah, that worse because obviously you have scratches all over you and you can't get rid of them, and everyone says you need to burn your clothes, and that's terrible. But I didn't get any kind of whooping cough or any sort of 19th century diseases from my living conditions. Just incredibly strange experiences, which did feel out of time, which did feel like I was in Orwell's description of Paris.
Yeah.
We've another-
Especially in the first place and with the tailor. I just think about the tailor and what
Yeah.
a piece of sunshine he was amongst all of what he was living in.
Yeah, he was an incredible character, and somebody who I went back to for many years to fix stuff, to get things repaired or clothes adjusted. And he had this sort of small Aladdin's cave, just tiny, with suits everywhere and stuff. And at the time he was living in it because of I think his wife was having an affair or something. And he was always talking about the shame of being, all his neighbors know that his wife has a lover or something. But he was incredibly insightful about this small street which we lived on. He knew all the different characters and was a real character. And just an example of the kind of people you come across. He was Egyptian, but been in Paris most of his life, essentially.
Yeah.
You could have felt like I would love to read Yusuf's memoir, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
A tailor in Paris.
He's got a lot. Yeah, he's got a lot of stories to tell for sure.
And I love how getting your clothes, your work clothes, tailored is so important to you. Like, clothing is such an interesting part of the book, because like people will not respect me unless I have those are cut right. And then later on, the red socks. So
of course, yeah, no. So a uniform by its very nature means everyone's meant to look the same, right? But as we know from school, you'll do anything to personalize it in any way possible. And the waiters were quite a vain bunch, right? They liked the fact that you're sitting down as a diner, you're literally looking up to them. They quite like that, looking down on you. They wanted to look well and elegant and nice, and so they took personal appearance very seriously. Haircuts, suits, everything. And so when I'd arrived at the restaurant, I didn't have any money. I just bought the first suit I could find, which was an enormous baggy thing. And so in order to sort of earn their respect, I needed to get it adjusted so I looked like more presentable, essentially. And so as I got money, I would get things adjusted until finally, when I became a waiter, I did what they all did and put my small touch on it, which was to wear red socks, which caused one of the managers to almost have a heart attack when he saw it. But luckily, the director of the restaurant was quite a fan of, I think he thought it was quite funny having a British waiter in a restaurant. And so he said, let it go. They're dandies. They had this idea of kind of sort of a David Bowie-esque, Oscar Wilde sort of English person in their mind. And I sort of managed to fit into that. So he was like, no, it's fine. They can do that. But yeah, appearance is very important. And Paris is a city that makes people dress well, I find. Even tourists seem to make an effort. When we're in Paris, we want to blend in, I guess, which is quite unique.
Except the shoes. Your shoes were taped together.
My shoes taped together. If the restaurant was very silent, you would hear my left foot squeaking. The front would come off. I remember at one point, I think my feet almost took on the shape of the shoe, just because they were just crammed into these terrible shoes. I mean, if you do become a waiter, invest in comfortable shoes, you run kilometers a day. You're on your feet all day. You don't sit down. All you'll do is watch people sitting down and eating, and the two things you can't do are sitting down and eating. It's torturous. So get comfortable shoes.
We have some of the questions I'm not sure that you can speak to. There's a question about ghost kitchens, but I suppose that's really a much more recent phenomenon in France as well as anywhere else.
I don't know.
Yeah, the dining experience is, it's something that is it's also more of a back of the house thing. Somebody asked you about comparing your book to Anthony Bourdain's, and as you said, that's a more of a chef back of the house story. But I would certainly say somebody who liked Anthony Bourdain would like this book. How's that?
I would. I mean, I hope so. And it's and to be mentioned in the same breath as Orwell or Anthony Bourdain is obviously a great honor. I wouldn't say it myself, but like it's nice when other people do. But it's easy to glamorize chefing. I know it's hard, intense work. There was an article recently in the BBC about it being like going to war, being a chef every time you have a service. But I think we forget about waiters, and so that's what this book's about. That's why very single-mindedly about the waiters. And interestingly, I don't know, I haven't seen the questions, but I was doing some research, and since COVID, obviously a lot of restaurants closed down, and a lot of waiting staff in the States as well have left their jobs. And last summer I think there were 200,000 vacant waiting jobs in France alone, and I think it was 1 million or over 1 million in America. So essentially, these jobs are hard work, and these people have found different. Even if they're working in a call center or as a delivery driver, at least you have fixed hours, and you're not going to be asked at 11 o'clock in the evening to keep working until 2. So yeah, that says a lot as well, I think, about the conditions for these people.
Yeah.
We do like to ask, anything contemporary that you're book-wise that you're recommending right now that you've liked?
Ooh, that's really tough.
Yeah,
I'm reading 2 old books at the moment. I'm reading a John le Carré book, and I'm reading Joyce Carol Oates on boxing. So this isn't at all about waiting or Paris or food. So I'll have to send you an email afterwards. I've got 2. They're all piled up around me, the books. What's the most recent thing? Oh, let me think. Putting me on the spot.
Well, Joyce Carol Oates and John le Carré are certainly wonderful recommendations. Lisa, do you have a last question?
Do you have a favorite food writer? Do you read a lot about, food or that's, including restaurants or anything like that?
No? I don't read, to be honest, I don't read too much about food. And the funny thing about my book, it's a book about a restaurant, but there's very little eating in the restaurant or descriptions of food unless I'm outside of the restaurant. I did read, was it AJ Liebling's sort of dispatches from when he was in Paris, and he talks quite a lot about food and wine. And then,
that's supposed to be really good.
Food reader. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, it's interesting.
This leads me to another question, though.
Yes.
Everybody's so hungry. Is the idea of a staff meal, which is not that I think it's pretty common in the United States for restaurants. I mean, they're sometimes really bad, sometimes they're okay, but nobody gets food there.
Yeah.
Not in this one. Food. Yeah. There was a great absence of food. I survived on coffee and cigarettes, basically, and stolen bread rolls just all day. It was terrible. Sometimes you wouldn't be given a break. You wouldn't have enough time to go and get something. So in other restaurants, I've seen them sat down eating, and I always think, if only I'd walked into this restaurant on that fateful day when I got a job. But I didn't know anything different, so I just went with it. And I think obviously if I was able to articulate even the most vague notion of being hungry, someone might have been able to point me in the direction of something to eat. But unfortunately, I didn't have that luxury at the beginning. So it was a very, very hungry time for sure.
Okay, very last question, because we did talk about the tipping. Someone asked me about this. How much should you tip when you go to a restaurant in Paris? This is for all your brethren.
This is a good question. I mean, the quick answer is there's no specific amount. I think what you need to remember is that in most of these places in Europe, they're being paid their wage is the legal minimum wage for that city. So it's the legal minimum to survive there, right? But most of us aspire to more than simple survival in life. So if you know the waiter, the staff has been making an effort, and even if they haven't and there's stress, that small gesture you'll make will make a big difference to their lives. And it's so much appreciated. Obviously, if your waiter is a miserable whatever and has been terrible, there's no obligation to, but spare some change here and there, or no, you can radically change somebody's day. That's an important thing.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We have a link to purchase the books from a Books and Company or Boswell, or your favorite. Just go into your favorite bookstore and tell them that they have to get the book in for you.
Please do.
And we'll also thank Alliance Française, and don't forget about the festival, French Film Festival at UWM that they've been involved with, but are not running. And also thank you to Lisa, and thank you for joining us from Switzerland, because that's a first for us.
Yes,
Thank
it
you very
is.
much for having me.